I want to welcome everybody to the TAXI webinar on Prevent, Teach, Reinforce for Young Children. This is Lisa Fox. I'm really glad to see so many people interested in this topic. I'm going to do a little bit of orientation for you to the meeting room and to the tools that you have. You should be listening to the meeting through your computer speakers and viewing the slides. If you have any technical difficulties, you can use the question and answer box to let us know, and we will try to assist you. Hopefully everybody's on board and listening and doing fine. So we are going to listen to this webinar through computer speakers. You can chat your questions during, we'd like you to do it as the discussion happens. As a question occurs to you or something you would like explained more, we are going to save time so that we can pose those questions to our presenters. And I'll be posing those questions. So you'll be able to type them in. Look down on the right-hand side of your screen for the little bubble. That's where you can chat in any questions you have or comments that you would like to make. You can also chat if you're having any audio-visual issues, and I'll be happy to try and get you assistance. There are some fabulous handouts with this webinar, a real wonderful bonus to the webinar from the PTR manual that no one has seen yet except for this special group that gets to be on this webinar. And you can download those handouts by highlighting them. If you look above the question and answer box, there's a webinar handout box. So if you highlight them with your mouse, then you should be able to click for download and download them to a file or to your desktop to view during the webinar. We also will be posting this webinar on our website along with the handouts, so there'll be plenty of opportunity to access them after the event. I'm very excited to be able to introduce and welcome our presenters, Glenn Dunlap and Janice Lee, both who are faculty with the Technical Assistance Center on Social Emotional Intervention and are authors of Prevent, Teach, and Reinforce for Young Children. And I'm going to turn it over to Glenn to take it from here. Thanks for being here, Glenn. And Janice.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much, Lisa. It's a joy for us to be here. Let me see if I can advance this. Okay. As Lisa indicated, this is a session about Prevent, Teach, Reinforce for Young Children. PTR-YC is a model of positive behavior support that's designed for use as a tertiary intervention for serious challenging behaviors of toddlers and preschools in early childhood classrooms. Now today, we aren't going to go over everything. By the time we conclude, we are not expecting that everybody who's participating will be a worldwide expert in PTR-YC. That's impossible. But we will look forward to providing an overview and familiarizing you with what PTR-YC is all about. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to describe the background and the purpose of PTR-YC. We're going to describe the steps of the PTR-YC model. We'll discuss how and when PTR-YC should be used. And of course, we'll respond to as many questions or issues that you might raise, and we're looking forward to that. I'm Glenn. I guess that's sort of obvious. Janice is with me. And I want to mention that we've been working on developing this model for a few years now, and we are in the process of beginning a large-scale research project on the model. That research project will occur here in Nevada and also in Colorado. And in Colorado, it will be led by Dr. Phil Strain of the University of Colorado at Denver and his very excellent associates with the University of Colorado at Denver and with the superb Pyramid Plus project of Colorado. So our plan today is for me to start with an introduction and a general overview. I will then turn it over to Janice, who will describe for you the nuts and bolts of the PTR-YC model, essentially the steps that one goes through to implement the model. When she has done that, she'll hand it back to me for a little summary and some wrap-up and final considerations, and then we'll open it up for questions and any kind of issues that you'd like us to address in any more detail. As I mentioned, it's morning here, and it's morning in most of the country. I realize that it's just turned afternoon on the East Coast. It's pretty early morning there in Alaska, and I see that we have some people from Alaska in the room with us today. Hello, Beth Snyder, and hello, other people. Great to have you with us. This is where we are. Yes, this is Reno, and Janice and I work for the Chamber of Commerce in Reno, Nevada. But it actually looks like this. There's snow in the mountains. It's a really pleasant community to be in, and we enjoy it a lot, and we urge you to come and enjoy the mountains and Reno itself. Okay, well, let's get started. PTR-YC has to do with challenging behavior. And what do we mean by challenging behavior? Well, what we mean is any repeated pattern of behavior that interferes with learning or engagement in pro-social interactions with peers and adults. This is pretty wide open, but the emphasis here is that the pattern of behavior has to be repeated. We don't refer to challenging behavior as a single incident or a single problem that might pop up occasionally, but it has to be repeated. It has to be something that is persistent and creates problems in the classroom. These are behaviors that are not responsive to the use of developmentally appropriate guidance procedures, and especially those behaviors that are not responsive to good, high-quality practices that we recommend be used in classrooms, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a couple of minutes. The behaviors that we typically see as challenging are prolonged tantrums, physical and verbal aggression, disruptive vocal and motor behaviors such as screaming, property destruction, sometimes self-injury, but also noncompliance and withdrawal. Noncompliance and withdrawal can be just as serious problems as occasionally disruptive vocal and motor behavior. So we include those in challenging behavior, and we emphasize that they are appropriate considerations for the use of PTR-YC. We're also referring to the most serious challenging behaviors, behaviors that are violent, that teachers describe as really out of control, and parents describe as out of control. These are the kinds of really raucous behaviors that sometimes lead to considerations of exclusion, seclusion, or restraint. Now, we hope that nobody needs to resort to these kinds of procedures, and we encourage that strategies be used to prevent any kind of thought of exclusion, seclusion, or restraint. I wanted to take this opportunity to refer you to an issue brief that we have prepared on this topic. And the issue brief is entitled Preventing the Use of Restraint and Seclusion, and it is easily found on the website that I know you're familiar with, challengingbehaviors.org. Now, I've mentioned that, but I also want to reiterate that PTR-YC is not only for the most serious challenging behaviors. It really is for any kind of repeated, persistent pattern of difficult behavior that interferes with the operation of the classroom, that interferes with the children's learning and social development. I'm looking at the slide here that's labeled intensive intervention, but this depicts the pyramid that I trust all of you have some familiarity with. The pyramid is a multi-tiered framework for organizing the implementation of evidence-based strategies in order to promote healthy social emotional development and, importantly, to prevent the emergence of challenging behaviors. The pyramid, like other multi-tiered systems, includes universal strategies, targeted strategies, and then the more tertiary or intensive intervention strategies. What's really relevant to challenging behavior in classrooms are the universal strategies. And the logic is that if universal classroom practices are implemented with a high degree of fidelity and consistency, that many challenging behaviors will not continue. That is, that they will be prevented and that children will establish improved trajectories of social-emotional behaviors and social-emotional development. And this is such an important consideration that we emphasize it within the Prevent, Teach, Reinforce for Young Children model. If high-quality, evidence-based classroom practices are implemented, we believe that it isn't always necessary to use individualized interventions. Or if it is necessary, perhaps the individualized interventions won't need to be so intensive or effortful. And let me mention again that we see this all the time. So I emphasize in bold that the message is to implement high-quality classroom practices. I know you have seen this as well, but Janice and I in particular have been doing training and technical assistance in various states around the country, and we've been assigned the role of working with behavior specialists and going over tertiary models such as Prevent, Teach, Reinforce for Young Children. But often when we emphasize the importance of universal classroom practices and teachers and other classroom personnel begin implementing them, we see those behaviors go away. And we see that there really isn't a need for intensive, individualized intervention strategies. Well, this is a great thing. It might put us out of work, but it's a great thing because, as we all know, engaging in assessment and intervention practices for individual children takes time. It takes a commitment. There's some resources that have to be considered. And it's not something we can do on a routine basis for many children. So if we can prevent these occurrences, it's a very good thing. So let me take a moment to identify 5 of the classroom practices that we recommend. And we talk about this when we describe Prevent, Teach, Reinforce for Young Children, and we even describe some specifics in the manual that I will refer to briefly in just a moment. The first practice is to use a very high ratio of positive to negative or neutral attention. When teachers interact with children, research has shown that if you really put a heavy load on positive encouragement statements to children, as much as a 5-to-1 ratio of positive to negative or neutral attention, that things will be a lot better, that a lot of difficult behaviors will evaporate if you see a very high ratio of positive to negative or neutral statements. Sometimes this can be hard to do. Children with disruptive behavior attract attention, and it's quite natural for people to respond to that. But the more we respond to that, in lieu of responding to positive behaviors, the worse things can become. So we really encourage teachers to make a concerted effort to use a very, very high ratio of positive attention. Next, use predictable and comprehensible schedules and routines. Here we're talking about schedules that are posted in the classroom walls that includes words and pictures and that are very, very clear for children and that describe the sequence of events so that all children in the classroom, including children with disabilities, know what's going to happen. Now, this doesn't mean that the schedule should be stagnant, that it shouldn't be interesting, that things shouldn't change. But the point is that children should be given the means to understand what's going to happen first, what's going to happen next, and so forth. Third is something that we call using routines within routines. And this is just another strategy for heightening the predictability of events that occur in the classroom. Let me give a real simple, quick example. Say you have a morning circle routine. Well, it's a routine in that it always happens. Every morning you have morning circle. So that's a routine. But within that routine, you might also have other routines. For example, one of the first things you do in every morning circle is to have a song. Okay. Well, then children get to know, to be able to predict that here a song is going to come. Within that song routine, you might also have other kinds of routines that can be embedded. For example, maybe the song will have props, and maybe one of the children will be identified to hand out the props. Okay. Maybe another routine is that one of the children will be asked to choose a song. So you see, if you embed these routines and children get to know the routines, then that will heighten predictability and as a result reduce the probability of challenging behaviors. Next is to identify, list, post with pictures, and teach behavioral expectations directly. Now, behavioral expectations can vary from routine to routine. Obviously, they will. Outdoor routines are going to have different behavioral expectations than morning circle time or sand table time or choice time. We recommend that there be maybe 2 or 3 behavioral expectations for each routine, and that teachers and other classroom staff take time before the routine to actually teach them, to show the pictures, to model them, to do that so that the children know what the behavioral expectations are. And then finally, that peer-related social skills are also taught directly. Almost every routine can have some peer-related social skills that you would expect to occur, and these can be identified and taught explicitly. So those are the classroom practices, and we are certain that if they are implemented with a high level of integrity and consistency, that you'll be successful in reducing a lot of the challenging behaviors that are occurring in classrooms, but not all. And for those behaviors that continue to persist, that's when we call on intensive individualized interventions, and in particular a process called Individualized Positive Behavior Support, PBS. And PBS, to review, is an evidence-based process for assessment and intervention for establishing desirable, competent behavior while reducing challenging behavior. A few years ago, some of our colleagues and I developed a model for school-age children called Prevent, Teach, Reinforce. This is a model of positive behavior support explicitly designed for schools, and it was designed in order to help school-based teams implement effective research-based practices in a consistent, practical, and feasible manner. Positive behavior, Prevent, Teach, Reinforce has been developed and disseminated, and a lot of research has already been conducted on this practice, and it's been shown to be pretty effective with elementary and middle schools. However, many aspects of PTR do not fit very well with young children or with preschool settings. That became pretty apparent. A number of the interventions that were identified weren't really developmentally appropriate for many toddlers or preschoolers, and the circumstances under which early childhood classrooms operate are different in some very important ways than middle schools and even elementary schools. Therefore, we developed Prevent, Teach, Reinforce for young children. And as I said, this has been in development for a number of years, and we've been doing some sort of field testing with it, and we have developed a manual. And this is what the manual looks like. It is not available yet, but it will be available in about 3 months. In March of this coming year. This manual describes everything about PTR-YC in considerable detail, It outlines all of the steps, and it also includes a CD that includes all of the forms and tools so you can download them. Again, this will be available soon. So let me describe actually what it is. PTR-YC is a model specifically for preschool settings for individualized intervention with challenging behavior. Detailed steps are included for designing and implementing positive interventions. And the steps include teaming and goal setting, practical data collection, functional behavioral assessment, intervention, and then follow-up and next steps. Very shortly, Janice will be going over what these mean. Let me emphasize right now, though, that it is a little bit involved, but individualized interventions are involved. They take a little bit of effort. They take some time. They take some meeting time. They take some planning. They take some conscientious attention to detail. And we do that because it's necessary. It's necessary to help these young children to develop improved trajectories of social development and to learn that they don't need challenging behaviors in order to be successful in their lives and successful in getting what they need to get done. However, PTR-YC was designed to be as practical as possible. If it's too effortful, nobody's going to do it. So we design it in such a way that it can be used by preschool teachers. And here are some features of PTR-YC. First of all, it's based on, it includes research-based practices for individualized assessment and intervention. It includes team-driven decision-making. The strategies are individualized. They have to be at the tertiary level. They have to be individualized. But how the decisions are made should be done by the classroom staff. It's stupid and unworkable and ineffective to have an expert consultant come in and write a prescription and expect people to follow it out, to follow those steps. It really, the steps, they have to be determined by the team, by the people who are actually going to be responsible for implementing the interventions. Now, this is a key aspect of PTR and PTR-YC. All of the behavior intervention plans include at least 3 components. They all include at least one strategy that involves antecedent manipulations, and we call that category prevent. They all include some instruction on social communication or social emotional skills. So teaching is involved in all PTR-YC interventions. And then some attention has to be paid to consequences. And so we call that reinforce. And voila, that's why we call it PTR, prevent, teach, reinforce. The fact that we have all 3 components included in every intervention plan means that the intervention plans have a very high probability of being successful. They become more robust because if one is not done perfectly, and that's life, then the others can pick up the slack. All right. The steps in PTR-YC are scripted as much as possible so that there's a very little chance that teams can deviate from the process that has been shown to be effective. And each step ends with a self-evaluation checklist. So that is, after you think you've completed the functional behavioral assessment, there are just some key questions. Let's say, have you done this? Have you done this? Have you done this? If the answer is yes, okay, then move on to the next step. The selection of interventions is menu-driven, and as Janice will explain, there's a considerable menu of evidence-based interventions that are available for teams to select from. And these interventions are described in detail in the manual. And the entire process, as I said, is manualized. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Janice to describe the specifics of the steps. Okay?
Great, thank you. So I'm going to review the steps
fairly briefly. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to go into them in a lot of detail, but hopefully this will give you an introduction to what's included in our manual and will provide you some information with how it's laid out. And as Lisa said at the beginning, on the right-hand side of your screen, under the webinar handouts, as we go through them, I'll be referring to them and we'll mention them again so that you can see them, because on the screen they may not be very large. So again, the first step is teaming and goal setting. And if you're familiar with PBS interventions, these steps will be very familiar to you, but hopefully we'll show you that we've provided some additional ways to make this process a little bit easier for people who are in need of individualized interventions for children. Again, as Glenn said, we see a number of times that if those classroom-wide practices are in place, it's very rare that teachers need individualized interventions for any of the children in their classroom. And so we really, in the manual, also really heavily emphasize the need for those things. And in some of our early field test opportunities, we're finding that as well, is that, you know, teachers still need some help, assistance, and coaching with implementing those kinds of practices for all the children in their classroom. So once you've identified the need for an individualized intervention, it's important to really identify and kind of get together as many relevant team members as possible. And part of our model and also an emphasis in the manual is about including families. That's always a need, I think, for every group, but we really emphasize that very, very much. And the idea with including families is to include them as much as possible and as much as they're willing. So we know that there's a range of ways that families can participate, and in the manual we describe and talk about those in a little bit more detail. And we know that there are families who can't participate for a variety of reasons. And so that parent participation doesn't exclude or include children who need individualized interventions. If you don't get that parent participation, then you know there's still a need that you have as a classroom teacher to have individualized interventions so that child can be successful. So you would still continue. Other relevant team members, we heavily encourage having an administrator or somebody who can help in terms of resource allocation. We always know that that's not always an option either, but we do encourage that. Generally, the classroom teacher is a requirement, basically, as a part of the team. And generally, if there's any classroom assistants or assistant teachers or co-teachers, obviously we'd want to include those people as much as possible, too. We also know that many children have either other service providers, either within the program itself or possibly privately. So again, including as many of those people as possible is encouraged, but we also know the challenges of that as well, so we recognize that. The initial step is really for the team to come together, have an initial team meeting, and to discuss and identify goals. This gets everybody on the same page. It helps people, hopefully to improve the relationships between the groups so that we could talk about challenging behavior, which is always which can sometimes be a difficult topic to discuss. It can really be a nice venue to really help improve those kinds of relationships, or to at least solidify those. What we've discussed in the manual is to begin with one target challenging behavior to reduce. And a lot of times we get comments that people really struggle with that. But in our experiences, what ends up happening is that for some children there are several or many behaviors that are challenging that they may be exhibiting throughout the day. The purpose of targeting one to start with is to find a workable process for how you're going to deal with and manage that challenging behavior. So that's why we really focus on the one. And then on the other hand, we also want one target appropriate behavior to improve. And so, for example, an appropriate social, emotional, or as Glenn mentioned, a communication skill. What we generally see in behavior plans are strategies to just reduce the behavior that is challenging. As many of you on this call probably know, is that You can't just get rid of inappropriate behavior. We also need to replace that with more socially appropriate behavior. And so part of our model really targets that. So let me show you one of the forms. This is our goal sheet. So it is really difficult to read. So under the webinar handouts, it's titled Goal Sheet. So if you want to pull that up so that you can look at it in more detail, I'm going to just review this fairly quickly. We created this sheet to help teams kind of work through the process. And so we've just laid it out in these steps. Basically, the first step is an area to, oh, thank you, Lisa. Look at that nice arrow. Is to identify the child's challenging behaviors that team members would like to see decrease. And we created this form to really provide a place to kind of brainstorm.
Do you know how to get this audio on? Do you know how to get the audio on here?
There you go.
Yeah, I have.
But Lisa, you're not on mute.
I am on. So if you're on the phone line, I need you to get off the phone line. You're going to listen to your computer speakers, or you may stay on the phone line, but you need to mute so we don't hear what's going on in the background. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. All right, so in this Form 1, like I said, the first step is to really identify which challenging behaviors are causing issues within the classroom. So then what you would do from that is you would, the next step is to have a discussion and figure out what is the main or target behavior that you really want to start with. And that's what would go in this second row. When you get to that point, then the idea is to develop an operational definition. And that's described a little bit more in the manual, but I'm sure many people who are in the room right now are very, very familiar with that. But basically the idea is to create a definition of what the behavior looks like so that we can measure it, because data collection is a big piece that I'll be talking about just here very shortly. But it is important to make sure that people are talking about the actual behavior in the same way. And again, we don't have a lot of time to go over that today, but that's where you would go. And then the next step is, as the team, is to really identify what behaviors do we want to see increase? What is this child not able to do that could really, really help them with not having to do the challenging behavior, for example? So this is where we would see many of the social skills, communication skills really be identified there. And again, this form is to really help teams kind of brainstorm some of those things. And then the idea is for the team to decide on one target behavior to increase. And again, this is to just help with ease of implementation. If we're asking adults to do too many different things, then that's not going to happen as well as we would like it to. And so again, we ask people to target and focus on one of each. And then again, with a target behavior, you would do the same thing, is to come up with an operational definition. And again, this is to make sure that everybody is talking about things in the same way. And also in terms of the data collection, that it's easy to track and easy for people to record accurately. So let's talk a little bit about some practical data collection issues. Data collection is important, and we really emphasize that in the manual throughout this whole process. But the first step is, when you have your definition, is then for the team to decide what data to collect. And this could happen within that same meeting. For some teams, that goal-setting process happens very quickly, and so you can quickly move into deciding what data is going to be collected. For other teams, this may have to be in a separate meeting. So it might be a second meeting. It could happen the following week. It could happen the next day. Just depending on how teams function, these pieces are individualized in that way. And in the manual for Prevent, Teach, Reinforce for Young Children, we recommend using either behavior rating scales or frequency counts. I'll show you our behavior rating scale if you're not familiar with those. I'll show you and briefly go over those. But we also include frequency counts because many times teachers and programs may already be keeping tallies, basically, about how often something might occur. So we really encourage, if that's something that you're already doing, you can continue with that. But if you haven't been collecting any information on the challenging behavior, then we highly recommend using the behavior rating scale. The next piece is to identify what you're going to collect, so that's where that discussion comes from, when it will be collected, and we say when because data collection process doesn't necessarily have to occur all day. If there's only a specific time that the challenging behavior occurs, for example, on the playground, or if it's only during dismissal time, then you want to target and focus your data collection only on those times. Another example is if you have a full-day program and perhaps the challenging behavior only occurs in the afternoon, then you would just target your data collection to only look at the afternoon pieces. The how is basically, how you're going to do it, what's going to be done, what are you going to be measuring, and how that's going to happen. And then it's important to identify who's going to collect it. Now, our data collection methods are simple, and they should only take a few seconds each day. But it is important to either identify a core person who's going to be collecting it every day, or if that role is going to shift, to identify whose turn it is, basically, for that day. But again, just identifying the details is important. And we always emphasize that data collection has to be easy. We want it to be as accurate as possible, and it needs to measure what it is intended to measure. And in our experiences, that's kind of where teams can struggle a little bit in terms of the data collection. We know, especially in early childhood, that's not always a common behavior for the adults, is to collect and measure information in terms of the challenging behavior. But again, this will help us throughout our process, and in terms of next steps is also very important. So again, this is the behavior rating scale. I know on your screen it's probably a little bit blurry, but again, under the webinar handouts, it is listed there. It's at the top, titled Behavior Rating Scale. And basically, this is just a way for teams to identify what they're going to collect on a Likert scale. It's fairly simple. We describe it on a scale of 1 to 5, and the areas are blank because the idea is that the teams themselves decide what those numbers correspond to. And today I don't have a lot of time to go into that. I'm assuming that many people who are listening are familiar with these rating scales, but if you are not, again, in the manual there is some more description about that. And then I have a simple example to share with you as well in terms of what you get from a behavior rating scale. This is not in your handouts, but this is just a simple example of what that might look like. And so again, this shows 3 different behaviors that you would be tracking. We only really target one. But again, as you can see, the range of how you would identify each number, what we call anchors, how you would label the anchors, is fairly simple. And then basically at the end of the observation period that's been identified, or at the end of the day, each column is 1 day. So you don't take data per incident. This is per day. So for this example, a teacher or whoever is identified to collect the data would be circling 3 numbers at the end of the day. We see in this example under hitting is the only data collection that has been collected, but you circle the numbers, and as you can see, you can just connect the lines, connect the dots, and you get a nice little visual graph. So for people that are visual, that can be very, very helpful. But again, it's not just to have something pretty to look at, but it's to see what is happening on a daily basis. And so this initial data collection is to really collect some baseline data before you get into the assessment and intervention process. And so we recommend that you have at least 3 baseline data points to begin with so we can see whether or not improvement is being made. Okay, so the next step is functional behavior assessment. And what we've developed in our model, which are indirect measures with a checklist format. And very briefly here, I will show you some examples of that, and you also have that in your webinar handout. But the checklist is to help identify any antecedents, environmental influences that may be contributing or influencing the behavior, to help determine what the function of the behavior might be, and to identify effective reinforcers, not only for challenging behavior, but also for desirable behaviors. And so all of those components are very important. The forms can be filled out individually or as a team. And we provide those options because sometimes it's helpful for individuals to fill out the forms because you can get a lot of information that you may not if you do it as a team or as a group. But again, in the manual, we kind of describe that there are a couple of ways that that can be done, and teams usually decide how they would prefer to do that. When they're filled out individually, that's helpful for people who can't be there, so this is kind of a nice way also to be able to get relevant information about the challenging behavior from people who may not be able to attend a meeting or participate as much as they would like. And really the goal for this process is to gather as much relevant information as possible. And also this checklist format provides a fairly efficient and quick way to gather as much of that information as possible versus one person, you know, interviewing people, doing observations in the classroom, those kinds of things. This can be, again, a very efficient way to gather that information. So again, here's a screenshot of the PREVENT checklist. This is just part of the checklist. And again, under your webinar handouts, you can open that up and see that in a little bit more detail. But these are just some questions to kind of get at what some of those influences might be. So for example, are there times of the day when challenging behavior is likely to occur? If yes, what are they? So you have options of morning, afternoon, you know, evening, during meals, nap time after meals, etc. And then there are questions. And again, depending on the challenging behavior that you're looking at, the individual can just go through the questions, mark what they think, and then there is always options to put others. So if things don't fit nicely in an option, then people can always feel free to write them in. And so this would identify those antecedent and environmental factors. This next one is teach. Again, this is in your webinar handouts, but this is really to help identify what skills the child may be missing and can really be looking at helping to identify what the team thinks is really important to be looking at. Again, this is not the whole entire checklist, but this is one page of the teach component. And then the final checklist is the reinforce component. And this is really to help identify, hopefully, effective reinforcers for the child, not just in terms of the challenging behavior, as I mentioned earlier, but also in terms of when children engage in the desirable behaviors that we want to see, what is going to be effective for them in increasing the frequency of those appropriate behaviors. So then what we provided is a summary table. And basically, I don't have a ton of time to go over that today, but basically using those functional behavior assessment checklists, so the PREVENT, TEACH, and REINFORCE checklist, you would use this form to summarize the information. And so we usually recommend that this happen in a meeting, that people come together. Again, it could be where people individually bring their forms and talk about it, or this can be part of the group discussion. It's kind of going through and figuring out how the team is really thinking about the data. And then at the bottom is where you would be, is a place to develop your hypothesis statement about the challenging behavior itself. And so this, again, this form is just utilized to help teams through the process to get them to the next step. Okay, once you've identified all of that, which is already a lot of work, then the idea is to figure out what intervention strategies are going to be put into place and develop a behavior intervention plan. So there's a menu of intervention options, which I'll show you here very briefly. In the manual, there are complete descriptions We provide several examples and considerations for when and how you would use the different strategies. Again, those are all laid out in the manual. Not surprisingly, there are 3 categories of the intervention, and the plan should include at least one intervention from each category. And as Glenn mentioned before, that's the same. And then including how the implementation will occur. So we really encourage writing out step-by-step instructions for what's supposed to happen and how those intervention strategies are supposed to be implemented. So really quickly, this is the menu of intervention strategies. This is also in your handouts titled Intervention Strategies. And as you see, they're by category. So the prevent strategies are together, the teach strategies are together, and the reinforce strategies are together. And again, this is just a menu, so a basic list of what the options are. And again, in the manual, they are listed, are described in detail and have examples, citations, and considerations. And so again, those are there. But when you create the behavior intervention plan, the idea is you would pick at least one strategy from each of the categories. And that's why we have the menu there to help people identify that. This next form, which is also in your handouts, is titled Plan Summary. Again, this is a form to just be used in terms of kind of a quick cheat sheet in terms of the behavior intervention plan. Many plans need a lot of detail that won't nicely fit on one sheet of paper. And so we created this to just as a way for teachers, school personnel to summarize the information in one spot so you don't have to go back and look through all the specific details, but it's really more of a visual prompt or reminder about what people are supposed to be doing. And it's a nice, easy thing that could be posted in the classroom, for example, as a reminder for teachers. Okay, so in terms of follow-up and next steps, just really briefly, I just want to emphasize that the step-by-step instructions need to be very clear, and they need to include the details of how the intervention plan will be implemented. So this includes who is going to do it, how it's going to be done, where those strategies will be implemented, when they're going to be implemented, and what materials are needed. So for many of the strategies, they don't necessarily require extraneous materials, but for several of them, they will. And so once the intervention plan has been developed, it's important to identify if there are additional materials that are needed and to provide the time in order to do that. And as this is going on, the data collection, that initial baseline data collection, should still be occurring at this time. And so that is something that will remain throughout this whole process. We also have a fidelity checklist to identify the necessary steps and also to see if, just to check for fidelity, are the interventions being implemented as they were intended? And I'll show you that here in just a minute. And then also it's important, once the intervention plan is developed, is to decide when you're going to review the progress. So for some teams, they want to implement, for example, for a week and then get back together and kind of talk about how things are going. For other teams, it might be a couple of weeks that they want to try it out and then to see how things are going. But again, it's important to identify that at the beginning so that, you know, if questions come up or if there are issues with the actual strategies, that those can be dealt with as quickly as possible. So here is the Fidelity of Strategy Implementation form. Again, in your handouts, that's listed as Fidelity. And the way it's been designed is that you would lay out the steps. It has spaces for 5 steps. We understand that many strategies may have more than that. You can list them as you need, but basically the questions that you need to be looking at are listed across the top, and it's basically just a simple yes or no. This can be used in a variety of ways that we talk about in the manual, so it doesn't necessarily need to occur on a regular basis, but this is a nice way to check and see, for example, if things are not going as well as you had planned, perhaps checking the fidelity of the implementation is something that you want to look at. Okay, turn it back to Glenn.
Okay, thanks, Janice. And I'm just going to wrap up a little bit here, and let me emphasize, as Janice has laid out, these steps can seem like a lot, and in fact, with individualized intervention, there is, a bit of work that's involved, like some meetings and so on. But I emphasize that this involves some work up front. It means having meetings and planning and being very careful and systematic about what you're going to do, what kind of intervention is going to be implemented, and to make sure that that implementation is done with consistency and high quality. If that work is done up front, then the rest can be pretty easy, including the collection of data, the assessment, and everything else that goes with it. And we expect if good work is done up front, then we will almost always see very beneficial results. A key thing to consider at this point is how you go about using data for database decision making. Janice described that we use frequency counts or more often the behavior rating scale, and these are for purposes of progress monitoring. These are simple, feasible strategies of data collection, and they're designed to truly reflect the most important outcome. If you look at your data and you see that progress is occurring as you had hoped, good. That's great. Keep going. That's exactly what we want to see. And we hope that most of the time that's what we'll see. In some circumstances, however, the progress that you see after a few days or after a week or after a couple of weeks might be unsatisfactory. You might not see reductions in challenging behavior, and you might not see increases in your targeted social or communicative behaviors. What do you do then? Well, I think the first thing you do is make certain that your data are accurate and that they are consistent with your impression. Sometimes we see that people look at the data and they don't match what they think they're seeing. Sometimes the data don't show reductions, but everybody in the classroom feels that reductions are occurring. Well, if that's the case, you go back to your data collection and make sure that the data are being collected consistently and that your definition of the behaviors is correct. Ideally, if enough work has been done up front on the data collection system, this will not be an issue. The second thing, if progress is unsatisfactory, is check fidelity. Be certain that the procedures are being implemented as intended. Janice described this briefly and showed you a form that we recommend be used, but it's important to make sure that everybody in the classroom is using the behavior intervention plan the way it was intended by the team to be used. So check the fidelity. If the fidelity is not what it should be, that is, if occasionally people in the classroom are not doing the teaching or not using the prevent strategies, then some correction needs to be made. Maybe people need to be trained. Maybe people need reminders. Maybe people in the classroom need pictorial reminders and scripts to make sure that they do it correctly. In some cases, maybe the procedures need to be simplified because maybe an instructional aide, for example, is not doing the procedures because it's just too effortful. They have to be looked at to make sure that the strategies are going to be implemented with fidelity, because I'll tell you, if they're not being implemented with fidelity, they ain't going to work. So check fidelity. Check the strength of reinforcers. This is a big issue in many, many cases. Just because a child smiles and receives the encouragement or enjoys the sticker, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a reinforcer for that behavior. There's been a lot of work done on reinforcement assessment and that kind of thing, and we encourage teams to take a very careful look at this and be open and flexible and creative with respect to what reinforcers are used and how they are used. And then finally, if those first three things all check out okay, then it may be important to recheck the functional behavioral assessment, including the functions of the challenging behavior. Maybe we haven't figured it out correctly. Maybe we should go back to the drawing board and look at our hypothesis statements and basically reconsider. Now, we strongly believe that if the steps are used with fidelity, and if you go through these kinds of strategies and you're not getting progress, then that's going to be a pretty rare occurrence. But such rare occurrences do occur, and we're not going to deny that in some cases it might be appropriate to bring in an outside expert who has lots and lots of experience with functional assessment and assessment-based interventions. PTR-YC is designed to minimize those circumstances, but we're not going to sit here and tell you that it's going to be effective in absolutely every case. So that is something to consider. Wrapping up, as you go through this, as Janice indicated, it's important to meet periodically. But you do this with all children in your classroom anyway. But make sure that things are going well, that little Julie's challenging behaviors are continuing to be reduced or eliminated, and just as importantly, that her social and communicative and appropriate emotional skills are getting better. As improvement is seen, sometimes it's appropriate to consider adding behaviors to the behavior intervention plan. Janice emphasized that we really think it's a good idea to start with one challenging behavior and one desirable behavior, but as those are handled, it's real possible to add behaviors if the need exists. As you work through this and as you see successes, share it with families, share it with colleagues. We hope that many people will benefit from this, and be sure to celebrate successes. A couple summary comments. PTR-YC is a model of positive behavior support. This isn't brand new information. Those of you familiar with individualized positive behavior support will recognize and appreciate every single step in here. However, it's specially designed for use in preschool settings, and the strategies are designed to be as practicable, feasible, I guess user-friendly as they can be. But ultimately, PTR-YC is positive behavior support. And there's lots of information about positive behavior support available on the internet and many, many other places. And as I tell people, I have looked at every single piece of information on the internet, and I believe that 98.67893% of that information is valid, accurate, and can potentially be useful. PTR-YC contains features that enhance the ease of use and fidelity, and we believe increases the likelihood of beneficial effects. And finally, some important considerations. Effective implementation of classroom-wide practices can resolve many challenging behaviors and may make the use of PTR-YC unnecessary. These are the classroom-wide practices that early on in this webinar I spent a little bit of time going over. These are not trivial considerations. We believe that they are the foundation and really should be used and implemented before individualized attention is considered. The commitment of classroom personnel is an essential factor. There has to be an investment in helping the young child who has challenging behaviors, and it means a little more effort, a little more instruction, a little more individualized attention. That commitment needs to be there. You know, when it comes down to it, this is probably the most important factor in everything that we've discussed. I wanted to remind you that there is a large study, a group comparison study that's being conducted in Washoe County of Nevada and in various sites in Colorado, and we hope to have more and more information about those findings as the months and years progress, and we'll be eager to share them. Training workshops on PTR-YC are being conducted occasionally. For example, at the National Training Institute in Clearwater Beach, Florida on March 20th of this coming year, we will be doing a full-day training workshop on PTR-YC, and that information is available on challengingbehavior.org, and this is what that's about. And with that, I want to thank you all for participating with us today. Wish I could see you, but it's been a pleasure seeing your names listed on the right side of my monitor here. And it's time to see if you have questions. And I believe I'm turning it over to Lisa to moderate these questions. Is that correct, Lisa?
Yeah. Yes, you are. And we have a lot of questions. So I'm going to pose some of them to you and to Janice. So Monica asks a really good question. What's the average timeline from baseline intervention, functional assessment, and then the start of the intervention?
That is a very good question. And the simple answer is about 2 months. But it varies from child to child. We believe that in virtually every case, as long as the child is in the classroom on a regular basis, that you can start from the very beginning and get fully satisfactory results within a 3 or 4 month period of time. But again, it varies depending upon how frequently people can come together for meetings, how long it takes to develop the intervention plan. It can vary on the complexity of the plan. Sometimes more complex plans require a longer time to get up and be implemented with fidelity. But the simple answer is about 2 months for the complete.
So 2 months from getting your baseline information to having a plan ready to roll, or is the plan ready to roll more quickly?
Yeah, it would be much more quickly than that. I'm sorry. I was referring to 2 months as from baseline data collection till the end until you have satisfactory results.
Wow. Yeah,
with young children, in the vast majority of cases, if you have a really good intervention plan in place, and we believe PTR-YC will do that, then it should not take very long to get the changes that you are looking for. But in terms of first getting a team together and then getting your data collection together, doing your functional assessment and developing the intervention plan and starting that, that probably takes at least 2 weeks and somewhere between 2 weeks and a month to get that done, I think.
Great. So Susan poses a question. Can you use this model in homes?
The model is basically the model of positive behavior support. Positive behavior support has been shown in many cases to be effective in home environment. As long as parents and others in the home environment are supported adequately, given the strategies, including making sure that the family is involved in helping develop the strategies and so on. We do understand that PTR has been used in some home situations, and that there is a study that is going to appear in the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders that describes the use of Prevent, Teach, Reinforce with young children in home settings. We haven't done formal research with it, but I have no doubt whatsoever that it can be used. Now, the manual that we have developed is for classrooms. So the intervention strategies and examples and assessment forms that you see in your handouts are designed for classrooms. If you wanted to use this specific model in homes, you'd have to modify those things so that they would be appropriate for home environments. But there's no question in my mind that it can be effective in home settings with the appropriate modification and individualization.
Great. And talking about families, does PTR include any handouts that help families kind of understand what's going on to be a part of this process?
We don't have those handouts developed at this time. We think it's a good idea to do that, but we had to kind of limit the parameters for the classroom. But when it's being implemented in a classroom, we strongly encourage the teachers and other folks, program directors, people involved with the classroom, work to communicate with families about it and to encourage their involvement.
I think people might find some of the handouts on the TAXI website that we've designed for families helpful in this process too.
Absolutely.
So Glenn, Erica poses a good and a common question, is how do you get buy-in from teachers to engage in this kind of process?
That's always a good question, and I think that's a question that we get very, very often in terms of teachers to buy into the process. Generally, in our experiences, teachers are struggling, they're frustrated. When you have a child with challenging behavior, it can really challenge your effectiveness as a teacher. And, commonly what we'll see, not always, but a common occurrence is that, teachers or directors will say, I'm sorry, we can't serve your child here, and so basically children are expelled. And many programs don't use that kind of vocabulary, but that's what is happening is kids get kicked out. So the buy-in from the teacher it's vitally important. And as Glenn mentioned, having staff commitment is probably the key to having this all work. So that can happen in a variety of ways. So as we know in terms of the pyramid model, that relationships are really, really important. And so I think in terms of this process is identifying kind of what the teacher's needs are and really listening and valuing their opinion is really important, and using this process to help them kind of streamline or pare down kind of where they want to begin. Because I think many times what I've seen in classrooms is that a teacher is overwhelmed and doesn't even really know where to start. And so I think encouraging them that there are improvements that can be made, that it will take, it might take some time, but, identifying what's going to work is important. Developing the plan with them, I think, is also important to emphasize that they have an important stake in the whole thing, and that the process really, the way it's intended, is supposed to make it as easy on teachers as possible. Now, we are asking them to change their behavior and to do different things. That, in and of itself, is not easy. But the intention is to make it as easy as possible throughout the process.
Janice, Glenn, go ahead.
Yeah, let me add just one thing on this, and that is that's one reason that we emphasize the teaming part. Mm-hmm. The teacher shouldn't be in this by yourself. That is, there should be a whole team of people that includes the parents or other family members, that includes the instructional aides, that includes the program director, that might include a mental health consultant or a speech language therapist. And these people all should be joining hands and having a unified commitment to help this child. And that really, really helps a great deal to achieve buy-in. If everybody agrees that the effort up front is worth it, that the investment is worth it, then we see a lot better outcomes.
Great. Tetta asked, are there any behaviors that are resistant to, are particularly resistant to being, that you would have success with this approach, I guess? Like a diagnosis or a mental disorder that precludes this from being effective?
Well, I think it boils down to what the functions of the behaviors are. And sometimes if the functions are hard to figure out, or if they involve internal processes, then it can be harder. For example, with children whose challenging behaviors are influenced by medical conditions, by seizures, by otitis media that is hard to observe, or by other factors like that, in those circumstances, it can be a lot harder for us to design behavioral intervention plans that are as responsive and focused as they need to be. There probably are some other instances that are parallel situations that can make behaviors more resistant, but I'm not sure exactly what those are.
There's one clarifying a term. One of the participants saw reinforced incompatible behavior and was unfamiliar with that. Can you explain what that is briefly?
Yeah, reinforced physically incompatible behavior is actually fairly simple. For example, if 4-year-old Billy has a challenging behavior of hitting his classmates by striking out with his hands, a physically incompatible behavior is having his hands quiet in his lap, or engaging in a desirable fine motor task, or doing something else with his hands. It's a fairly simple concept. If a child, little Lucy, has a challenging behavior of screaming and breaking windows with the high frequency of her screaming episodes, then using quiet voice, using the inside voice, is physically incompatible. So if you reinforce that and increase the strength of that behavior, then necessarily the challenging behavior will decrease.
Yeah, it's kind of remarkable something so simple has such strong evidence as well as can be so effective. Glenn, while I have you on the phone, someone asked for just a real quick example of a kid. Like, here's a kid with a problem behavior. This might be a prevent, a teach, and a reinforce. And because I got to preview your manual, you have really lovely illustrations that really help bring all of this alive. Maybe you or Janice could share a really quick little example.
Sure. Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, I don't think we mentioned, but in the manual there are 4 complete case studies that we've utilized to describe the process in a lot more detail. So we're hoping that that's helpful for people moving along. And we tried to use descriptions of children and of families that are fairly diverse, and of behaviors that are from, that respond quickly to intervention to those that are ones that would take kind of a long time to implement. So one quick example that I can give is of a child who's in a early childhood classroom, and she's 4, and she's an English language learner. And so her challenging behavior was really in terms of noncompliance, and it was really around a specific routine and time of day. And so one of the prevent strategies that were identified from the team was really to utilize more visual supports and schedules, and we combined that actually with providing choices. And so this is a fantastic teacher who, she's an unofficial pyramid model class. She has an unofficial pyramid model classroom. But for example, when we conducted the teapot at the beginning, she scored very, very highly in all the areas. And our subsequent observations have really confirmed that she's an excellent teacher. But again, she had this one child who had very consistent and chronic noncompliance during their second large group time. And so so again, the prevent strategies that we identified were to combine visual supports and schedules with providing choices. So one example to get her to the carpet for the second time is the teacher took pictures of her in a few different areas, and so she had 3 options. So she could either sit on the carpet by herself, she could sit with the classroom aide, or she could choose a friend to sit with. And so again, the teacher took 3 individual pictures of this actual girl in those different scenarios, and before, about a couple minutes before they were going to be going to carpet, she would be presented with the options. She could either choose then or decide to choose later, and then that really helped reduce her resistance to transition to that particular activity. In terms of the teach strategies for this girl, it was really about teaching communication. As I mentioned, she's an English language learner. She almost exclusively responds to and communicates in Spanish. The classroom teacher speaks English only. She does know Spanish phrases, but the classroom assistant speaks in Spanish and is bilingual in Spanish and English. And so really the teach strategy for her initially is to really improve her communication skills, especially with the teacher. We did talk about some peer-related social skills as well, but that's something that we're going to be slowly introducing here in the next coming weeks. And then really the reinforced strategies were to really reinforce her desirable behavior. And another thing that we had talked about for this particular case was to make it more concrete. So the teacher and the aide and even the mother described that she would respond to verbal praise. But they felt like it wasn't powerful enough, that it wasn't enough to improve her behavior. And so we discussed, and the team came up with a way to make it more concrete for her. And so they basically used stamp markers and could give her stamps on her hand as a way to pair their verbal praise and make it more concrete for the girl. And also for when she went home, that mom could see kind of how many stamps, for example, she got for that day, because this is a girl who would also towards the end of the day would ask, did I have a good day, because that corresponded with her access to privileges at home with her mom and dad. So that's just a really brief example of something, of a teacher and a case that we're working with currently.
Great. Thanks for providing that illustration. I think that's really meaningful. So here's a hard question. One of our participants works with a mental health consultant that's a child psychiatrist, and that psychiatrist feels really strongly that children who are aggressive need PBS, but also have to have some aversive consequence if they have unsafe behavior. So can y'all comment on that?
Yes, I'm happy to comment on that. With all due respect, I disagree with that position. There's a lot of research, just tons of research, that demonstrates that aggressive behavior, like any other behavior, can be managed quite successfully with non-punitive strategies that include instruction, but might really emphasize antecedent manipulations and environmental redesign. If you identify those variables, those antecedent events, those things that happen in the environment that are associated with a high likelihood that aggression is going to occur, then you can remove those things from the child's environment. And let me add that it is essentially almost always possible to do that. It is almost always possible to do that. If you look carefully enough, there are things in the environment that happen that tend to trigger aggressive episodes. Now, sometimes it takes some creativity and some inventiveness to find out how you can remove those things, at least for a long enough period that you can do adequate teaching. But the nice thing about antecedent manipulations like this is you can prevent even the most violent kinds of behaviors from occurring. And if you can prevent them, that provides a window for you to teach the child more desirable, more appropriate, more pro-social kinds of ways of meeting her needs. I hope that answers the question.
That's a great response, and somebody has chimed in with amen. One more question about PTR-YC's applicability. Can you use your manual with infants?
I don't know, and I would not make that suggestion. It's not designed for infants. It's designed for toddlers and preschoolers, and especially with preschool environments. You know, in some cases, the overall positive behavior support process can be relevant with infant behavior, but the process is not designed for infants, and I would not presume to suggest that it would be. Janice might be a better person to answer this question, given that she has a little girl who is not yet 2 years old.
Yeah, I don't use the actual manual itself on her, but many of the strategies are used with her, and not in the corrective sense necessarily, but in the teaching sense. You know, I have to give her warnings. You know, she's like Glenn said, she's not even 2, but I have to give her warnings. I provide, you know, a lot of if-then, first-then kinds of statements to her. I utilize visual supports as much as I can. I utilize choices multiple times a day because she is a strong-willed child who likes to say no very, very often. And early on, we targeted communication skills in terms of, you know, sign language and gesturing, really encouraging her verbal language. And, you know, every day we work on social skills, and every day I try to reinforce, you know, her appropriate behavior as much as I possibly can. So in those senses, you know, I guess, yes, I do use manual, but it really is about effective teaching for infants.
I've observed Janice's interactions with her daughter, and she uses a 5-to-1 positive to negative ratio.
Good. Hey, somebody said, so is it for typically developing children? And why don't you clarify the population that PTR can be used with?
You know, you folks are asking great questions. You're filling in the blanks. I really appreciate that a great deal. And yes, PTR-YC is for all children with challenging behaviors. It is explicitly designed for children who have disabilities, autism, intellectual disabilities, attention problems, social emotional difficulties, and for children without any kind of disability label, for typically developing children who happen to have persistent, repeated, challenging behaviors. So thank you for asking the question. It is a process that is appropriate for all children. And in our research, we are conducting it within the realms of special education programs, general education programs, Head Start programs, child care programs, inclusive programs, and so thank you.
So we're almost out of time, and there's a whole flurry of questions about how quickly can I get the manual, when is it coming out, where do I get it, can I pre-order it, and do you envision ever an iPad application? So I'll let you answer all of those questions.
Well, the manual is published by Paul H. Brooks. It is possible to pre-order it on the Paul H. Brooks website. Easy to get to. It will be out, I have been promised, in early March. It's not going to be out before then, and there's no way that we can get it to you before then. We don't have it before then. An iPad application is intriguing. I don't have particular plans for it, and it would be something that we would need to address with our publisher.
Well, great. So thank you both so much. This has been a wonderful webinar, as well as providing these really interesting tools. Thanks so much to our participants for coping when we had a few sound difficulties. You know, you you get something that's accessible to everybody, and we give a little bit sometimes on the quality. I want everyone to know that by the beginning of the new year, this will be posted on the TAXI website so that you can access it and listen to it again. And again, thank you, Glenn and Janice, for being so willing to do this and sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.